A young Luftwaffe pilot, Oberfeldwebel Klaus Hartmann, squinted through the armored glass of his Focke-Wulf 190, his gloved hand steady on the control column. Below him, the patchwork farmland of Normandy stretched like a faded quilt, stitched together by hedgerows older than the war itself. The air at 20,000 feet tasted metallic through his oxygen mask, thin and bitter, carrying with it the faint tang of engine oil and cordite from the morning's earlier engagement. He had seen the silhouette emerging from the cloud bank to the west, fat, bulbous, and possibly large. It looked less like a fighter and more like a flying milk jug, all bulk and no grace. Through his radio headset came the crackling laughter of his wingman, Lieutenant Friedrich Weiss. "Look at that American cow," Weiss said, his voice thick with contempt. "It flies like a pregnant duck." Hartmann allowed himself a tight smile beneath his mask. The massive aircraft lumbering toward them seemed to confirm every assumption the Luftwaffe had cultivated about American engineering: big, crude, excessive. Built by a nation that valued quantity over artistry, mass production over the elegant precision of German design. For nearly 4 years, the Luftwaffe had ruled the skies of Europe with an iron fist wrapped in aluminum and steel. From the blitzkrieg over Poland to the desperate dogfights above Britain, German pilots had flown with a sense of technical superiority that bordered on religious conviction. Their Messerschmitt Bf 109s were sleek predators, purpose-built for air superiority, lean and lethal. The Focke-Wulf 190, introduced in 1941, had stunned the Royal Air Force with its raw power and devastating firepower. These were machines crafted by engineers who understood that every kilogram mattered, that drag was the enemy, that a fighter should slice through the air like a knife through silk. German pilots trained in a tradition that emphasized individual skill, aggressive tactics, and the aristocratic notion of aerial combat as a modern form of knighthood. They wore their kill markings with pride, counted their victories in the careful script painted on fuselage sides, and truly believed that no nation on earth could match the combination of German engineering and German valor. Then came reports of the new American fighter. Intelligence photographs showed an aircraft that seemed to violate every principle of fighter design the Germans held sacred. It was massive, weighing in at nearly 8 tons fully loaded, more than twice the weight of a Bf 109. Its radial engine, a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp, protruded from its nose like a barrel chest, giving the aircraft a blunt, aggressive profile that lacked any pretense of aerodynamic elegance. The fuselage was thick and deep, designed around a turbo supercharger system that occupied massive ducting running beneath the pilot's seat. Where German fighters were minimalist and refined, this American machine, designated the P-47 Thunderbolt, looked like it had been designed by men who had never heard the word compromise and didn't care to learn it. In the officers' mess, all scattered across occupied Europe, Luftwaffe pilots shared their opinions freely. The Americans, they said, were trying to compensate for their lack of fighting spirit with sheer size. They were sending their pilots into battle inside flying fortresses, armored coffins that would be easy prey for experienced German aces. The P-47 became a joke before it ever fired a shot in anger, a symbol of American excess and naivety. How could such a beast possibly turn with a nimble 109? How could it climb with a properly flown FW 190? The laughter echoed through ready rooms from St. Omer to Abbeville, from Beauvais to L'Isle-d'Aude. What those laughing pilots did not know, could not know, was that they were staring at the future of air warfare and seeing only the past. The P-47 Thunderbolt was born not from naivety, but from hard-won lessons written in blood across the skies of Europe. Its designer, Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian émigré working for Republic Aviation, had watched the air war evolve from a distance that provided terrible clarity. He saw the Luftwaffe's fighters operating at altitudes where the thin air strangled conventional engines, where British Spitfires gasped for oxygen and lost power. He saw the need for an aircraft that could escort American bombers deep into Germany, fighting at heights where the curvature of the Earth became visible and frost formed inside cockpits. Kartvel's solution was radical in its simplicity. Build the fighter around the most powerful engine available, accept the weight penalty, and use American industrial might to solve problems through brute force engineering. The R-2800 Double Wasp produced 2,000 horsepower, eventually pushing to 2,800 with water injection, channeled through a turbo supercharger that allowed the Thunderbolt to maintain full power at altitudes where German fighters struggled to breathe. The resulting aircraft was a paradox wrapped in aluminum, a 7-ton fighter that shouldn't have worked but somehow did, and did so with devastating effectiveness. Asterisk, but it was not the engine alone that would transform the P-47 from a joke into a nightmare. It was the 8 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns mounted in its wings, 4 per side, each capable of firing 850 rounds per minute. In total, the Thunderbolt could unleash over 6,800 rounds per minute of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition, each bullet weighing just under 2 ounces and traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The .50 caliber round, developed decades earlier for anti-tank warfare, was a uniquely American contribution to aerial combat. While European nations favored smaller caliber weapons or cannons, the United States had invested heavily in developing a heavy machine gun that combined range, accuracy, and devastating terminal ballistics. A single .50 caliber round could punch through engine blocks, shred hydraulic lines, tear apart control surfaces, and explode fuel tanks. A 1-second burst from all 8 guns sent nearly 113 rounds of this heavy metal thunder toward the target, creating a cone of destruction that turned enemy aircraft into falling debris. American armorers loaded the ammunition in patterns armor-piercing, incendiary, tracer, creating a stream of fire that could be seen for miles, a visible manifestation of industrial might translated into kinetic energy. Klaus Hartmann did not think about any of this as he pushed his throttle forward and rolled into an attack position. He saw only the fat American fighter, which had apparently not spotted him yet, lumbering along at 18,000 feet. This would be easy. He would come in fast from the sun, the classic bounce, and his 4 20mm cannons would make short work of the oversized target. Perhaps he would claim his 13th kill before lunch. The spring sun was warm on his left shoulder as he dove, building speed, his wingman trailing behind in proper formation. The American grew larger in his gunsight, still apparently oblivious, still flying straight and level like a training aircraft on a Sunday pleasure cruise. Then the American fighter did something that should have been impossible. Without any visible preamble, without the gentle banking turn that every pilot used to change direction, the P-47 simply snapped into a 90-degree bank and pulled hard, its nose coming around with startling violence. Hartmann felt his stomach drop, not from his own maneuvering, but from the cognitive dissonance of watching something so large move so quickly. He adjusted, pulling harder on his stick, feeling the G-forces press him into his seat, his vision beginning to gray at the edges. But the American wasn't running away. Instead, impossibly, it was turning into the attack, committing to a head-on pass. Hartmann had a split second to register this tactical insanity. No sane pilot chose a head-on pass if they could avoid it. The closure rates were too high, the risk of collision too great, before the P-47's nose lit up with muzzle flashes. The sound came through the airframe itself, a rattling thunder that seemed to shake reality. Tracers streaked past Hartmann's canopy, not the delicate firefly traces he was used to from rifle-caliber guns, but fat, furious streaks of light that looked like they had physical weight. His FW-190 shuddered as rounds impacted the engine cowling, the wings, the armored windscreen. One round punched through his left wing and exited through the bottom, leaving a hole the size of a man's fist. Another struck his propeller hub and ricocheted off with a sound like a church bell being struck with a sledgehammer. Hartman broke off the attack instinctively, rolling hard right and diving, his heart hammering against his ribs, his hands suddenly slick inside his gloves. Behind him, Lieutenant Wyss was screaming something unintelligible over the radio, his transmission cut off by static and then silence. Hartman risked a glance back and saw Weiss's aircraft trailing black smoke from its engine. The cowling panels peeled back like the skin of a gutted fish, already beginning the long death spiral toward the French countryside below. The engagement had lasted perhaps 3 seconds. This scene, or variations of it, played out hundreds of times across the European theater between the spring of 1943 and the end of the war. The P-47 Thunderbolt, entering combat in April 1943 with the 56th Fighter Group, quickly earned a reputation that bore no resemblance to the mockery that had greeted its arrival. In its first month of combat operations, P-47s claimed 37 German aircraft destroyed against 8 losses, kill ratio that would only improve as pilots mastered the aircraft's unique characteristics. By the end of May, that ratio had climbed to nearly 5-to-1. By the summer of 1944, experienced Thunderbolt pilots were achieving kill ratios approaching 7-to-1 against the vaunted Luftwaffe. The laughter died in the throats of German pilots, replaced by wary respect and, increasingly, fear. What transformed the P-47 from a figure of fun to an object of dread was not any single characteristic, but rather the combination of attributes that reflected a fundamentally different approach to air warfare. Where German fighters were designed around the assumption of pilot skill and tactical finesse, the Thunderbolt was designed around the brutal arithmetic of industrial warfare. It could absorb punishment that would destroy any German fighter. Its air-cooled radial engine, lacking the vulnerable coolant systems of inline engines, could take multiple cannon strikes and keep running. Pilots returned from missions with cylinders shot away, with holes torn through wings and fuselage, with control surfaces shredded, and still made it home. One P-47 pilot, Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group, limped back to England after an engagement where German fighters had hit his aircraft with more than 200 cannon and machine gun rounds. The Thunderbolt's rugged construction and redundant systems meant that catastrophic failure was rare, a stark contrast to the fragile German fighters where a single, well-placed round could sever a control cable or puncture a coolant line, turning a thoroughbred into a coffin. The P-47's weight, once mocked as a liability, became an asset in the hands of pilots who understood energy tactics. While it could not turn with lighter fighters in a sustained dogfight, the Thunderbolt could dive like a meteor, building speed until it approached the sound barrier itself. Its thick wings and robust structure allowing it to pull out of dives that would tear the wings off a Messerschmitt. American pilots developed tactics that exploited this advantage, fighting in the vertical plane rather than the horizontal, using altitude as a bank account from which they could draw speed whenever needed. They would climb high on their supercharged engines, spot German formations below, and then dive through them at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, triggering their 8.50 calibers in passing before zooming back to altitude on momentum alone. German pilots, trained in the fluid, turning dogfights that had dominated the early war, found themselves confounded by an enemy who refused to fight on their terms, who treated air combat as a physics problem rather than a test of individual valor. But it was those 8 machine guns that truly haunted the Luftwaffe. German pilots had grown accustomed to the relatively light firepower of early American and British fighters. The Hurricane and early Spitfires carried .303 caliber machine guns, rifle-caliber weapons that required extended firing passes to inflict serious damage. Even the later cannon-armed Spitfires carried only two 20mm weapons with limited ammunition. The P-47's armament was something altogether different today. Weight of fire that transformed brief firing opportunities into kill shots. That could saw the tail off a FW-190 in a 2-second burst. That could ignite a BF-109's fuel tanks from angles that should have been non-lethal. American ammunition production, powered by industrial capacity that dwarfed Germany's, meant that P-47 pilots could afford to fire when German pilots would have held their fire, could afford to spray and pray when necessary, could afford to be wasteful because waste was a luxury America could provide. The statistics told a story that transcended individual courage or tactical brilliance. By the end of 1943, the P-47 equipped 18 fighter groups in Europe alone. These groups flew thousands of sorties per month, escorting bomber formations deep into Germany, sweeping ahead of the main force to engage German interceptors, and increasingly dropping down to strafe German airfields, rail yards, and motor convoys. The Thunderbolt, it turned out, was not just an air superiority fighter, but also an exceptional ground attack platform. Its rugged construction allowed it to fly low and slow through intense flak. Its 8.50 calibers devastating against soft targets. And its ability to carry bombs and rockets transformed it into a multi-role weapon that German fighters, designed purely for air-to-air combat, could not match. Luftwaffe airfields became killing grounds where P-47s would sweep in at dawn or dusk, catching German fighters on the ground or just taking off. Their 8-gun broadsides, shredding aircraft that never had a chance to fight back. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe was profound and cumulative. For years, German pilots had operated with the confidence that came from technical superiority and hard-won experience. They had bested the Polish Air Force in days, humbled the French in weeks, and fought the RAF to a bloody stalemate. But by mid-1944, that confidence had eroded into something closer to resignation. Young replacement pilots rushed through truncated training programs as Germany's fuel and time ran short, arrived at frontline units to find veterans speaking in hushed tones about the American Thunderbolts. They were told not to engage if they could avoid it. They were told that if they saw the telltale silhouette, the bulbous nose, the wide wings, they should run. Because in a turning fight, the P-47 would eventually bring its guns to bear. And when it did, death came in a storm of half-inch bullets that ripped and tore and shredded until there was nothing left but burning wreckage falling toward the earth. Oberleutnant Heinz Nock, a German ace with 33 confirmed kills, recorded in his diary an engagement with P-47s over Germany in March 1944. We climbed to intercept the bombers, he wrote, but before we could reach them, the Thunderbolts fell on us from above. I have never felt such terror in combat. The volume of fire they produce is beyond description. My wingman was hit and killed in the first pass. His aircraft simply disintegrated. I dove away at full throttle and only escaped because I was willing to push my aircraft beyond its limits. Many of my comrades were not so fortunate. This from a man who had survived years of combat on the Eastern and Western fronts, who had faced Soviet fighters and British Spitfires, but who found in the P-47 something that transcended his previous experience of air combat. The transformation in perception was not limited to frontline pilots. Luftwaffe High Command, reviewing loss reports and combat assessments, recognized that the air war had fundamentally shifted. In early 1943, Germany's fighter force had inflicted unsustainable losses on unescorted American bomber formations, shooting down hundreds of B-17s and B-24s. briefly creating the illusion that the strategic bombing campaign might be defeated through attrition. The arrival of long-range escorts, particularly the P-47 and later the P-51 Mustang, destroyed that illusion completely. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe was losing pilots faster than it could train replacements, losing aircraft faster than factories could build them, losing the war of attrition that it had hoped to win. The Thunderbolt, flying top cover for bomber formations, made it effectively impossible for German interceptors to reach the bombers without first fighting through the escort screen, a fight that German pilots increasingly declined to accept. The symbolic power of the P-47 extended beyond its technical characteristics or combat record. It represented, in aluminum and steel, the vast industrial capacity of a nation that had transformed itself from isolationist democracy to arsenal of democracy in the span of a few years. Every Thunderbolt that appeared over Europe was a reminder that America could produce fighters by the thousand, train pilots by the hundred, and sustain losses that would cripple any European nation. German factories, operating under constant air attack, struggled to produce 1,000 fighters per month by 1944. American factories produced more than 3,000 P-47s alone during some months, along with thousands of other aircraft types. The Thunderbolt's very existence was a form of strategic messaging. We have so much of everything, so much aluminum, so much steel, so many engines, so much fuel, that we can afford to build fighters that weigh 7 tons and burn fuel at rates that would bankrupt your logistics system. And we can fill the sky with them. For German pilots, accustomed to operating in an environment of increasing scarcity, where fuel was rationed, where ammunition was precious, where replacement aircraft arrived slowly, if at all, the profligacy represented by the P-47 was both incomprehensible and demoralizing. American pilots flew multiple sorties per day, burned through ammunition in training exercises that would have consumed a German unit's monthly allocation. And when their aircraft were damaged, they simply requested another from the seemingly endless supply flowing across the Atlantic. The contrast was philosophical as much as material. German doctrine emphasized conservation, efficiency, making every shot count, while American doctrine emphasized volume of fire, saturation, overwhelming force applied without hesitation. The .50 caliber machine gun, in this context, became more than a weapon. It became a symbol of American abundance, a mechanical manifestation of the idea that more was better, that problems could be solved by application of superior force. That quantity had a quality all its own. The sound of those 8 guns became one of the signature sounds of the air war over Europe. Allied bomber crews, fighting their way through flak and fighter attacks, learned to recognize the distinctive buzzsaw roar of P-47s engaging German interceptors, a sound that meant relief. That meant the Luftwaffe had problems more immediate than reaching the bomber stream. German civilians, watching dogfights unfold in the sky above their cities, learned to distinguish the deep, throaty bark of American .50 calibers from the sharper crack of German 20mm cannon sounds that signaled who was winning and who was dying. Pilots who survived being shot down by P-47s, whether they landed in Allied territory or managed to make it back to German lines, reported the same details: the muzzle flashes that seemed to turn the enemy fighters' wings into sheets of flame, the impacts that sounded like hail on a tin roof, the sudden realization that their aircraft was no longer responding to controls because the control runs had been severed by multiple hits. By the summer of 1944, as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy and began the long push toward Germany, the P-47 Thunderbolt had achieved complete air superiority over Western Europe. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. unable to contest Allied air operations in any meaningful way. German fighters still flew, still fought, still occasionally scored kills. But they did so with the desperation of men who knew they were losing, who knew that each mission might be their last, who knew that the Americans and British owned the sky and there was nothing they could do about it. The transformation was total. The aircraft they had mocked in 1943 had become, by 1945, one of the instruments of their nation's destruction. The records speak with cold clarity. The P-47 Thunderbolt flew more than 500,000 sorties in the European theater, more than any other American fighter type. It destroyed over 7,000 enemy aircraft, roughly half in air-to-air combat and half on the ground. It dropped 132,000 tons of bombs and fired 135 million rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. Of the 15,636 Thunderbolts built, 3,499 were lost in combat, a loss rate of roughly 22%. Remarkably low for a fighter that spent the war flying into the teeth of German defenses. 28 P-47 pilots became aces in a day, achieving 5 or more kills in a single mission, a feat that spoke to both the lethality of the platform and the target-rich environment in which it operated. The top P-47 ace, Colonel Francis Gabreski, claimed 28 aerial victories before being forced down and captured, and later claimed another 6.5 victories flying F-86 Sabres in Korea, a testament to the training and tactics developed in the crucible of the European air war. But statistics, no matter how impressive, fail to capture the human dimension of what the Thunderbolt represented. For American pilots, many of them barely out of their teens, the P-47 was a lifeline. Its ability to absorb damage meant that errors in judgment, and there were always errors, didn't necessarily mean death. Its firepower meant that when opportunities arose, they could be exploited decisively. Its range eventually extended to over 800 miles with external fuel tanks, meant that they could stay with the bombers all the way to the target and back, fulfilling the escort mission that was their primary purpose. The pilots who flew the Thunderbolt developed an affection for it that bordered on reverence. They gave their aircraft names, painted nose art on them, wrote letters home describing the Jug, as they nicknamed it, short for Juggernaut, with the kind of affection usually reserved for family members. When given the option to transition to the lighter, more nimble P-51 Mustang, many P-47 pilots refused, preferring the rugged reliability of their heavy fighter to the elegant but more fragile Mustang. For German pilots, the Thunderbolt represented something darker, the industrialized face of total war. The moment when individual skill and tactical brilliance became insufficient. When the war became a matter of mathematics and economics, production capacity and resource allocation. In the aristocratic tradition of aerial combat that had dominated the early war, the Luftwaffe had excelled. But the P-47 belonged to a different kind of war, one where factory output mattered more than individual aces, where the side that could afford to lose and replace hundreds of aircraft and pilots would ultimately prevail. The Thunderbolt was democratic in the truest sense. It made average pilots effective and good pilots deadly, reducing the impact of the individual genius that German doctrine had always emphasized. An experienced Luftwaffe ace might still have the skill to defeat an individual P-47 in the right circumstances. But there were never just individual Thunderbolts. They came in flights of 4, in squadrons of 16, in groups of 48, and they just kept coming, day after day, month after month, until there was nothing left to fight them with. The eastern sky over Germany, in the final months of the war, held a particular quality of light, thin, and cold, filtered through the smoke of burning cities and the haze of industrial destruction. In those skies, the last generation of Luftwaffe pilots flew their final missions, knowing that the outcome was predetermined. That survival was a matter of luck rather than skill. That the American fighters with their 8 guns and endless ammunition were simply the visible edge of a vast machine that could not be stopped by courage or desperation. Some continued to fight with fanatic determination, downing Thunderbolts and Mustangs even as their own numbers dwindled. Others took the first opportunity to land in Allied territory and surrender, preferring captivity to the certainty of death. All of them understood, whether they articulated it or not, that the laughter of 1943 had been the laughter of men who didn't understand what they were facing, who mistook the symbol for the substance, who saw the heavy fighter and failed to see the nation that could build 10,000 of them in the end. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not just an aircraft. It was a physical manifestation of strategic philosophy, a three-dimensional argument about the nature of modern warfare. Where German engineering sought efficiency and elegance, American engineering sought sufficiency and overwhelming force. Where German doctrine emphasized the individual warrior, American doctrine emphasized the industrial system. Where Germany fought with the resources of a continent, America fought with the resources of a hemisphere. The 8.50 caliber machine guns, firing in unison, spoke with a voice that said, "We have more. More steel, more fuel, more ammunition, more pilots, more time. We can afford to be wasteful because waste is abundance, and abundance is victory." Every burst of fire was a small demonstration of industrial philosophy, transformed into kinetic energy. Every downed German fighter, a proof that the war would be won not by the best individual aircraft or the most skilled individual pilot, but by the nation that could produce and sustain the largest number of adequate systems operated by adequately trained people. The irony was not lost on thoughtful observers on both sides. Germany had entered the war with some of the finest aircraft and best-trained pilots in the world, with a tactical and operational doctrine honed in the Spanish Civil War and perfected in the early Blitzkrieg campaigns. But excellence, it turned out, was not enough when facing adequacy multiplied by 1,000, by 10,000. The Luftwaffe could not train replacement pilots fast enough to match American production of replacement pilots. It could not repair damaged aircraft fast enough to match American production of new aircraft. It could not innovate and adapt fast enough to counter American doctrinal evolution. The heavy fighter they had mocked in 1943 became the instrument that broke their backs in 1944. Not because it was better in every measurable category, it wasn't, but because it was good, enough in every category that mattered. And because there were so many of them that individual superiority became strategically irrelevant. Klaus Hartmann survived the war. He was shot down for the final time in January 1945 by a flight of P-47s while attempting to intercept a bomber formation over Hanover. He managed to bail out and spent the last months of the war in a military hospital, recovering from burns and a broken leg. In interviews conducted years later, he was asked about the moment when he knew Germany would lose the air war. He thought for a long moment, his eyes distant, before answering. "It was not a single moment," he said. "It was the accumulation of many small moments. But I remember the first time I saw a P-47 up close, after my wingman was killed. I remember thinking that this was an ugly aircraft, crude and heavy. I remember thinking that we would have no trouble with such machines. And I remember, 6 months later, watching them fill the sky like a swarm of angry hornets and understanding that we had been fools. They had built a fighter that matched our strengths and exceeded them where it mattered. They had done it with resources we could not match. And they had done it while barely straining their industrial capacity. That was when I knew. Not that we might lose, but that we had already lost. And all there remained was to determine how many more would die before the end. The 8.50 caliber machine guns of the P-47 Thunderbolt fired their last shots in anger over Europe in May 1945. as the Third Reich collapsed into rubble and memory. But the lessons they taught continued to echo through the decades that followed. The Thunderbolt had demonstrated that modern air combat was not a gentleman's sport but an industrial process. That air superiority could be achieved through systematic application of material advantage, and that the side with superior production capacity and training infrastructure would prevail regardless of individual technical excellence. These lessons shaped American air doctrine for generations, influencing everything from the F-4 Phantom to the F-15 Eagle, aircraft that prioritize reliability, firepower, and the ability to be produced in quantity over the pursuit of theoretical maximum performance. On a spring morning in 1943, German pilots laughed at the fat American fighter with its blunt nose and massive wings. They laughed because they did not understand what they were seeing, because they mistook mass for weakness, because they believed that elegance would triumph over brute force. The laughter died in the summer skies over France and Germany, choked off by the thunder of 8 guns firing as one, silenced by the realization that they were not facing a fighter but a philosophy, not an aircraft but an approach to warfare that their own exhausted, besieged nation could not counter. In the end, the P-47 Thunderbolt did not win the war alone. No single weapon system ever does. But it was there, in the sky over Europe, every day from spring 1943 to spring 1945. A 7-ton reminder that wars are won not by those who build the best weapons, but by those who build enough good weapons and have the will and resources to use them without hesitation, without mercy, until victory is achieved or the enemy is destroyed. The Thunderbolt was America's answer to the question of air supremacy, and the answer was written in .50 caliber rounds, delivered at 850 rounds per minute per gun, until there was no one left in the sky to argue.